Detachment is not disconnection. It is spiritual elevation. There is a sacred moment in every believer's life when God begins to pull them away from the noise of their emotions, the cravings of their flesh, and the distractions that have quietly weakened their spirit. This moment does not come with TBR Hunter, it comes with a whisper. A whisper that says, rise above this. You are called to more than this. Your spirit is stronger than your attachment. Many people misunderstand detachment and assume it is coldness or indifference, but in truth, it is the highest form of spiritual clarity. When your heart is no longer imprisoned by what you feel, you become available for what God wants to reveal. When your emotions no longer dictate your decisions, your destiny becomes guided by divine wisdom rather than temporary impulses. Think of how much spiritual energy is lost simply because people cling to things that no longer serve their purpose. They cling to emotions that wound them, relationships that drain them, habits that distract them, and desires that weaken them. But the moment they detach even slightly, it is as if heaven breathes on their spirit and says, now I can lift you. Detachment is not rejecting the world. It is refusing to be ruled by it. It is the discipline of recognizing that the things you once thought you needed are often the very things that held your spirit down. When God calls a person higher, He first teaches them the art of releasing. There is a divine power in the quiet act of letting go of the craving to be understood by everyone, letting go of the emotional reactions that once controlled your peace, letting go of the need to prove yourself, letting go of the foods, habits, or comforts the enemy once used to distract you. When you let go, you don't lose, you rise. You rise above the old patterns. You rise above the spiritual fog. You rise above the noise of your own emotions. Detachment is spiritual altitude, and altitude always brings clarity. At higher ground, your spirit sees what your emotions never could. When a person is emotionally and spiritually attached to the wrong things, the enemy hardly needs to attack them directly. He simply pulls the strings of those attachments. If your emotions control you, then he only needs to stir your emotions. If your desires control you, then he only needs to tempt your desires. If our cravings control you, then he only needs to present you with distractions. He never needs to touch your destiny. He only needs to manipulate your attachments. This is why detachment is a weapon, because it removes the handles the enemy once used to steer your life. Real detachment empowers the believer to walk with steadiness, even when the world around them becomes unstable. A detached spirit does not crumble under pressure, because its foundation is built on something deeper than feelings. A detached heart does not fear loss, because it understands that everything surrendered to God returns in a higher, purified form. A detached mind does not chase validation, because it has discovered the peace that comes from divine approval. And when a person reaches that level of spiritual maturity, it is as if the chains of this world fall off without resistance. It is in detachment that a believer ever becomes sensitive to the voice of God. When the clutter of emotional turmoil is cleared away, the whisper of the Spirit becomes unmistakably clear. When the fog of desire dissipates, the direction of heaven becomes visible. Detachment sharpens discernment, because it silences the noise that once drowned out divine instruction. It removes the unnecessary weight that made the journey feel difficult and allows the believer to run with endurance instead of dragging the burden of emotional dependence. God elevates those who are not anchored to earthly things. He strengthens those who refuse to be ruled by impulses. He trusts those who can walk away from comfort in order to pursue calling. The higher your destiny, the lighter your heart must become. Detachment is not losing your humanity, it is finding your spiritual identity. It is understanding that your emotions are real, but not your ruler. Your desires are legitimate, but not your master. Your attachments are familiar, but not your future. There is freedom in saying, I choose purpose over pleasure. I choose calling over craving. I choose God over everything that distracts me from Him. That freedom becomes power. That power becomes clarity. And that clarity becomes transformation. Detachment is not the end of feeling. It is the beginning of truly living. It is the beginning of walking, not as a person ruled by emotions, but as a spirit led by God. And once a person steps into that level of spiritual maturity, they become unstoppable, not because they are strong, but because they are free. What you refuse to be controlled by, you rise above. This is one of the greatest spiritual laws. Yet many people never discover it because they spend their lives wrestling with symptoms rather than confronting the root. A person who is controlled by emotions will always live at the mercy of circumstances. A person who is controlled by cravings will always live at the mercy of temptation. A person who is controlled by the need for approval will always live at the mercy of rejection. But the moment you decide deep within your spirit, TBR had nothing but God will rule your heart, something shifts. You rise above the level where the enemy once fought you. You rise above the patterns that once made you stumble. You rise above the emotional storms that once determined your peace. Rising above is not the result of trying harder. It is THPRE, result of surrendering deeper. The enemy studies what controls you because it reveals where you can be influenced. If he knows your heart is controlled by fear, he attacks through fear. If he knows your heart is controlled by appetite, he attacks through temptation. If he knows your heart is controlled by insecurity, he attacks through comparison. He does not care what tool he uses. He only cares that you remain attached to something earthly enough for him to manipulate. But when your spirit becomes firm, when your heart becomes anchored, and when your inner man declares, I will not be moved by this anymore, he loses his grip. You rise above not by escaping the world, but by refusing to be ruled by what rules the world. There is a supernatural strength that begins to form inside you when you decide that your emotions, your desires, and your cravings will not dictate your destiny. At first, the pull of old patterns may feel strong. The appetite may whisper. The emotions may surge. The distractions may appear attractive. But each time you refuse to bend, you grow. Each time you say no, your spirit gains ground. Each time you choose discipline over desire, heaven adds another layer of authority over your life. Rising above happens in small victories long before it becomes a visible transformation. You begin to see that the things which once shook you no longer have the same power. The words that once wounded you no longer cut as deep. The temptations that once overwhelmed you no longer stir you. The distractions that once pulled you off your path no longer interest you. Why? Because you have risen above them, not by human strength, but by spiritual mastery. When the Spirit of God strengthens a person, that strength does not shout, it stands. It stands firm. It stands steady. It stands unmovable. The world believes power is loud, but heaven knows true power is unshakable. When you refuse to be controlled, you step into this kind of power. A quiet, resolute, unbreakable power. The kind of power that can walk into storms without trembling. The kind of power that can face temptation without collapsing. The kind of power that can love without needing validation. This power is not born in comfort. It is born in surrender. It is born in the decision to rise above what once ruled you. Rising above is not arrogance. It is spiritual maturity. It is saying, I recognize this emotion, but I will not bow to it. I feel this urge, but I will not be led by it. I see this distraction, but it will not define my direction. Each declaration breaks a chain. Each decision strengthens your identity. And once a person becomes ungoverned by external forces, they become governed by the Spirit. Their vision becomes clear. Their decisions become wise. Their path becomes steady. When God sees a person rise above emotional bondage, He entrusts them with greater responsibility. When He sees them rise above temptation, He entrusts them with greater blessing. When He sees them rise above cravings, He entrusts them with greater influence. Because God does not elevate those who are easily swayed. He elevates those who can stand firm in the midst of spiritual pressure. Those who rise above earthly attachments can be entrusted with heavenly assignments. And here is the mist. Every time you rise above something, you also rise toward something. When you rise above emotional chaos, you rise toward peace. When you rise above temptation, you rise toward purity. When you rise above distraction, you rise toward purpose. When you rise above fear, you rise toward destiny. The enemy wants you controlled so he can keep you low. But heaven wants you free so you can rise into everything God has prepared for you. And the moment you refuse to be controlled, you begin the ascent. A quiet, steady, powerful ascent. From the level of the flesh to the level of the spirit. From the realm of distraction to the realm of clarity. From the grip of temptation to the embrace of destiny. And once you rise, you never return to the level where the enemy once defeated you. You walk in a higher dimension, stronger, clearer, freer, and unshakably aligned with the purpose of God. Spiritual PBR increases when emotional dependence decreases. Many people do not realize that the greatest battles they fight are not against visible enemies, but against the invisible strings attached to their hearts. These strings pull them toward fear, toward insecurity, toward temptation, toward approval, toward cravings that weaken their spirit. As long as those strings remain, no matter how much they pray, fast, or declare victory, something inside them stays bound. But the moment they begin to release their emotional dependence on anything earthly, a new dimension of spiritual authority begins to form within them. They do not become less human. They become more spiritually awake. There is a depth in God that only opens when a person stops allowing their emotions to be the voice that guides them. Emotions are real, but they are unstable. They can shift with the weather, with a memory, with a CBR moment, with a circumstance. When a person depends on emotions to lead their decisions, their spiritual life becomes a roller coaster. One moment they feel strong, the next moment they feel weak. One moment they feel faith rising, the next moment they feel fear returning. This instability is not a cybergn of spiritual failure. It is a sign of emotional dependence. And emotional dependence is one of the quietest ways the enemy steals a believer's authority. But when a person says, my emotions may speak, but they will not rule, something shifts. It is like a spiritual anchor drops into their soul. They no longer collapse when disappointment comes. They no longer lose themselves when temptation whispers. They no longer crumble when rejection hits. They stand not because they feel strong, but because they have decided that their feelings will not determine their faith. This decision is the Biber Arth of spiritual authority. Authority is not loud. Authority is not emotional. Authority is not about moments of inspiration. Authority is about endurance. It is about consistency. It is about standing firm when the ground beneath you shakes. It is about choosing obedience even when your ions parallel in another direction. When emotional dependence decreases, endurance increases. When emotional dependence decreases, clarity increases. When emotional dependence decreases, obedience becomes easier, worship becomes deeper, and prayer becomes more powerful. A person who is free from emotional dependence is a dangerous weapon in the hands of God. The enemy cannot manipulate them with fear because they do not depend on emotional comfort. He cannot manipulate them with temptation because they do not depend on emotional satisfaction. He cannot manipulate them with rejection because they do not depend on emotional approval. They become spiritually untouchable, not because attacks stop coming, but because their spirit has risen above the level where attacks used to shake them. Many people pray for power, but they do not realize that spiritual power is impossible where emotional dependence remains. If your emotions control you, you cannot command spiritual atmospheres. If your cravings dictate you, you cannot speak with heavenly authority. If your insecurities shape your decisions, you cannot walk with kingdom confidence. Power is not something God gives randomly. It is something He entrusts to those who have trained their emotions to bow to their spirit. This is why detachment is not a punishment, it is preparation. It is the process through which God strengthens you so He can pour more into you. It is the process of stripping away what weakens you so He can clothe you with what empowers you. You cannot carry spiritual weight while being emotionally fragile. You cannot walk in divine purpose while being controlled by earthly impulses. You cannot speak with authority while thinking with insecurity. God purifies before He elevates, and He strengthens before He assigns. When emotional dependence fades, a quiet confidence rises. Not confidence in self, but confidence in God. You begin to walk differently, not because life becomes easier, but because your spirit becomes stronger. You begin to see challenges differently, not as threats, but as training. You begin to approach decisions differently, not out of fear, but out of discernment. Your life becomes steady. Your heart becomes unshaken. Your mind becomes anchored. And once a believer reaches that place, the enemy recognizes something has changed. He sees that the buttons he once pressed no longer work. The traps he once set no longer catch you. The temptations he once used no longer attract you. The emotions he once stirred no longer rule you. You have shifted dimensions. You are no longer driven by what you feel. You are driven by what you know. And what you know is this: your spirit is stronger than your immature ions. Your purpose is greater than your cravings, and your destiny is higher than your distractions. And in that moment, spiritual power becomes your natural posture. Not because you became perfect, but because you became anchored. Not because emotions disappeared, but because they lost their throne bar. Not because life became peaceful, but because you became unshakable. And when a person reaches that level, heaven trusts them with authority, blessing, revelation, and assignments that are reserved only for those whose spirits are stronger than their emotions. The highest form of confidence is rooted in surrender. This truth is difficult for the human mind to accept because the world teaches that confidence comes from control of outcomes, control of reputation, control of circumstances, control of emotion, even control of other people. But spiritual confidence does not rise from TBR role, it rises from release. It rises from the moment a person says, I trust God more than I trust my understanding, my feelings, my strategies, or my strength. This kind of surrender is not weakness, it is spiritual intelligence. It is the recognition that you were never meant to carry everything on your shoulders. True confidence is being able to walk boldly while knowing God is the one who guides your steps, protects your path, and strengthens your spirit. A surrendered heart does not panic when the future looks uncertain, because it knows who holds the future. A surrendered mind does not drown in overthinking, because it has learned to rest in divine wisdom rather than human analysis. A surrendered spirit does not fall apart when life becomes unpredictable, because it has discovered the secret place where God's presence stabilizes every storm. Confidence that comes from surrender. Kaber, not be shaken even when the world around you is trembling, because it is built on a foundation that does not move. When a person lives surrendered, they no longer need to perform for approval or chase validation. They no longer seek their identity through people's opinions or achievements. They understand that their worth is established by God, not by the shifting voices of the world. This releases them from the exhausting cycle of trying to prove themselves. Their confidence becomes effortless, natural, and unforced, not born from ego, but from security, not from pride, but from peace. And wherein a person stands in that kind of peace, the enemy loses one of his most effective weapons, the weapon of insecurity. Insecurity is rooted in self-dependence. It grows when a person tries to control too much and trust too little. But surrender uproots insecurity from its core. Surrender says, I am enough because God is enough. Surrender says, what is meant for me will find me. Surrender says, I will walk with courage, not because I see everything clearly, but because I know God sees what I cannot. This is the kind of confidence that radiates without effort, the kind that makes a person sober and walk with quiet authority, the kind that draws blessing without striving. When you surrender, your steps gain clarity. You no longer jump from emotion to emotion or decision to decision without direction. God begins to guide you in ways you did not expect. Ideas come easier. Wisdom flows really. DBR discernment sharpens. You begin to recognize what is for you and what is not. You begin to sense when God is closing a door and when He is opening one. This internal clarity is a gift given only to surrendered hearts, because surrender removes the noise that once drowned out God's voice. Surrender Albar so transforms how you respond to challenges. Instead of reacting with fear or frustration, you respond with stability. You begin to see each difficulty as a divine tool shaping you, refining you, and preparing you. You stop asking, why is this happening to me? And begin asking, what is God forming in me through this? This shift in perspective produces an unshakable calm. It becomes impossible for the enemy to destabilize you when your confidence no longer depends on situations but on surrender. A surrendered person is also harder for the enemy to tempt. Why? Because temptation loses its power over someone who is not trying to fill emotional voids. When your heart is anchored in God, rather than in cravings, distractions, or worldly desires, nothing external can compete with the peace you carry. You no longer reach for temporary comfort because you are rooted in eternal strength. Temptation tries to pull you, but your spirit remains still. Distraction tries to lure you, but your focus remains sharp. You walk with a purity that comes not from effort, but from alignment with God. The beautiful irony of surrender is that the less you try to control, the more stable your life becomes. The more you release, the more God restores. The more you loosen your grip, the more He strengthens your steps. When you surrender, you do not lose yourself, you discover your true self. You become the person God intended you to be, confident, steady, purposeful, anchored, and deeply secure. And when a person reaches this state, heaven begins to entrust them with greater responsibility, deeper revelation, and higher calling. They become a vessel God can use because their confidence is not built on emotion, but on surrender. Not built on pride, but on trust. Not built on the world, but on teach BRE, unshakable presence of God. In the end, everything God desires to build in you begins with one sacred choice, the choice to detach from what weakens you and surrender to what strengthens you. The battle was never about the food, the cravings, the emotions, or the distractions. It was always about YBR, our spirit. It was always about whether you would allow the enemy to steer you through subtle attachments or whether you would rise into the authority God designed for you. Every time you let go of what controls you, heaven releases what was prepared for you. Every time you silence the noise of emotion, the whisper of God becomes clear. Every time you choose discipline over desire, your spirit grows stronger than the forces that once held you down. This is the journey of transformation, rising above emotional bondage, breaking the chains of craving, quieting the storms within, and walking in the steady power of a surrendered heart. This is where spiritual confidence is born, not in striving, but in surrender, not in emotion, but in alignment, not in self, but in God. And when you reach that place of clarity, everything begins to shift. The temptations that once controlled you lose their voice. The distractions that once pulled you lose their appeal. The battles that once defeated you lose their influence. Because your spirit has risen to a level where the enemy can no longer reach you. So stand firm, walk free, live detached from what drains you and attached only to the one who strengthens you. This is your moment to step into a higher dimension of power, purpose, and spiritual authority. When you release what the enemy used to bind you, God releases what He has always intended to bless you. And from that moment on, your life, your mind, your destiny, and your entire spiritual atmosphere will never be the same again.